Welcome to Session 3 in Stream 3, Problem Solving, Success Stories, and Lessons Learned. Our next speaker is Dr. Charlene Senn, who will be speaking on her experience and lessons learned in taking time to do prevention right. If you're in the wrong session, please navigate to the session you are looking for through the menu on the left of your screen. Click the Sessions button and then click on the section you'd like to attend. Charlene Senn is a professor and a Canadian Institutes of Health Research Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Sexual Violence at the University of Windsor. She is a social psychologist committed to the belief that high-quality theory and research evidence can be used not only to understand our world, but also be applied to make it better. Her research centers on men's violence against women and girls, and since 2005 has focused on sexual violence prevention. She developed the Sexual Assault Resistance Education Program, referred to as Flip the Script with EAAATM, for women in the first year of university. Implementing EAAA resulted in reducing the sexual violence women experience by 50% across the next 2 years, while also reducing women blaming and self-blame. To date, it has been implemented on campuses in 5 countries. She has active research collaborations in the U.S. and Canada to adapt and evaluate EAAA for other groups. For example, for younger girls in the community, ages 14 to 17, and for Francophone and trans university students. Her frontline experience in a women's shelter and other community organizations inspired her past and ongoing collaborations with sexual assault centers and Wendo Women's Self-Defense. She also contributes to sexual violence prevention and policy change through her consulting with universities and government committees and task forces in Canada, the UK, and the US. Welcome, Dr. Senn.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. So I wanted to start out just by saying that my research focuses on campus sexual violence, and so I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit today. But everything I'm talking about really is also relevant for young adults who do not attend university, and I would be happy to answer any specific questions you might have about that. I also want to note that high-quality trauma-informed services for survivors are critical to our ability to respond as a society well to sexual violence, and I really think that work is so important, and many of you are involved in that, I think, in your communities, but that is not what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, and now my clicker just stopped working. There we go. My parents were immigrants to this country, and I was born here. I respect the long-standing relationships with First Nations people in these and other places in what we now call Canada. I'm speaking today from the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Normally, I work in Windsor, Ontario, on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. I care about, sorry, stop using my clicker. I care, as you do, about all sexual violence committed by people of all genders and against people of all genders. However, it's important to really recognize that sexual violence is a distinctly gendered crime, and we need to attend to this really in our approach. The vast majority of victims are women and girls, regardless of race, social class, or social identity. And the majority of perpetrators are heterosexual men. But of course, the vast majority of men are not perpetrators. In universities, the most conservative statistics we have are that 1 in 5 young women will experience a completed rape by the time she graduates university. We also know that 1 in 10 young men report something that is equivalent, basically is completed rape by the time they complete university. So that's 1 in 10. The rates of sexual violence have remained unchanged for decades. Many people feel like because we're talking about it more that it's happening more. It's not, but it hasn't decreased either, and that is the very hard thing. The rates remain unchanged when we ignore the lessons of good prevention. And that's why collaborations with researchers and other experts in prevention of gender-based violence are so important. So what do we know? Because we can't know until we do. All right. One of the things very important to take home with you is that prevention that is effective is targeted. There is never any one size fits all. If we try and do that and we say, we're just going to have one program, we're just going to do this one thing, we are pretty much guaranteed that it will work for no one. That is the way that this works. All right. What else do we know? Knowledge is great. As you can tell from my bio, I've spent a lot of time in institutes of higher learning. I value that, as I'm sure you do. But knowledge does not necessarily translate into behavior change. In fact, it rarely does without additional effort. So if you think about something like HIV transmission, knowledge of condoms' roles in preventing transmission, virtually everyone has that knowledge, but the desire and ability to enact safer sex practices, that's something else altogether. Similarly, raising awareness is a positive thing and is a starting step, but it isn't prevention either. So consider it the foundation of your prevention efforts. So what else has gone wrong with our prevention efforts? And there are a few things. I'm not going to focus on what goes wrong, but here I'm just giving you a nutshell version. Basically, we know now if we frame the problem incorrectly, right, or we have the wrong theory about why it occurs, then our solutions are doomed to fail. We just won't have any success, even if the people we deliver it to like it a lot, and they often do really like our various programs, no matter whether they are effective or not. So an example in this field of sexual violence would be if we presume that sexual assault occurs because of miscommunication or because of lack of knowledge about the laws of consent, and we focus all of our efforts there, we will be unsuccessful. So that is an example in this field. And if you have any questions at the end about that, I'd be happy to talk more about it. So what we know now is no one size fits all. We need a comprehensive plan for sexual violence prevention. And I'm sure that you will share these goals with me. Our primary goal is we need to end perpetration. And if we could all go home. We could be having a celebratory conference instead, right? But we just aren't close yet. Most of the programs have been entirely ineffective, or sometimes even have backlash effects and make the target audience, usually boys and men, more coercive after taking them. So there are some promising programs, and I can certainly talk about them if you're interested, but we are not even close to being there yet. We also need to change the culture, and Me Too and all of the conversations in newspaper articles and all of the work that you do, we are all working to try and change the culture. But we also know that culture change is not fast, and also as you can, from recent events, it can go backwards, right? So you can make real efforts and move forward and towards social justice, and then those can be undone. So we need to do that, but we can't just rely on wait around for that. We also know now that we can empower citizens to take responsibility when they see something is wrong and to intervene. And this would be the kind of thing like bystander interventions that you will often hear about. And those are really important, but we can't rely on those only as our only strategy either, because what most people don't recognize is that bystanders are not actually present in the majority of sexual assaults. So bystander kinds of approaches are really great for precursor activities or before, about interrupting environments where risk is growing, those kind of things. But bystanders are rarely going to be around during the actual event. So every day on our campuses and in our communities, women are still being confronted by men they know who are attempting to sexually assault them. And so we need another goal as well. And that is to provide women with the knowledge and skills that they need to deal with this reality. And the program that I developed, and I'm going to talk more about, is designed to address this goal. Okay. So I said that you have to have sort of the right approach or the right theory, right framing of the problem. If my program is going to focus on women, then what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Well, what we know is that there is a mismatch between cultural messages, which focus on public environments and stranger risk, and on women's responsibility for their own safety. Okay, so that's what we've got going on. So here's an example, don't walk home alone across campus. Don't go out at night alone. Call campus security or so on. But by contrast, most sexual violence is perpetrated in social settings that should be safe. Things like this party, or on dating situations, or when you're studying with friends. And even more importantly, the vast majority of perpetrators are men who are known to women. That is, they're the classmates, the friends, the neighbors, the family members, the intimate partners. So what happens when we have this mismatch of the messages that you're growing up with and then the realities, and the contradiction that this creates, is that in fact, girls and women are taught to be fearful and take precautions in their lives which restrict their freedom but don't provide any real safety because they're focused in the wrong place. And those messages also reinforce this idea that sexual assault only happens to other women out there, the women who weren't taking those precautions or who weren't being careful, right? So there's that kind of message that goes along. And so then when the danger comes from men, someone you know, then there's a delay in acknowledgement of that risk or of that danger necessarily, and often shock and confusion and doubt about whether you're reading the situation right and all of those things. And harm continues both in that situation and afterwards. And women often internalize that responsibility and blame that because they've been taught that it's their responsibility to protect themselves in that way. So this is the problem we're trying to solve. So the program I developed, and I'm just highlighting here, I'm taking a brief moment to highlight the kind of work that goes behind the scenes, and I'll come back to that at the end. This took place over more than a decade of development and writing and research. And it was built on these high quality theories and a strong research evidence base, but also on best practices and the knowledge of mostly women in the community since the 1970s who've been doing frontline work in rape crisis and women's self-defense and so on. The program was always designed to be inclusive of all students, at that time students, who identified as women, of all sexual identities, cultural and religious backgrounds, and physical abilities. So it was always meant to be as inclusive as possible. But before I go any further, I want to also talk about this idea of risk, because I've said it's a bad thing to make women feel responsible, and at the same time I'm saying here I'm going to give women knowledge and skills. So the program itself, Flip the Script with EAAA, which the EAAA part is at the Enhanced Assess, Acknowledge, Act Sexual Assault Resistance Program. In every part of the way it's done, in its content and in the way that it's facilitated, undermines woman blaming. It sends this very clear message that risk is only present if there is someone in that environment who is willing to engage in sexual coercion. In other words, alcohol, there's no risk of rape associated with alcohol, right? There's a risk of hangovers, there's a risk of other things. There's no risk of rape unless there's someone in that room who is willing to engage in sexual violence. The other thing is that women are always themselves the best judge of what they could or should do. So the program does not tell women what they should do, and it does not hold women responsible for men's behavior. So I'm going to give you a situation to think about, to hold in your mind. Then I'm going to talk about the program in more detail, but this way you'll hopefully have a little context to think about. So it's just one example. So a woman answers the door of her apartment one night. There's a knock, and she sees at the door her roommate's boyfriend. She tells him that her roommate isn't home, and he insists on coming in anyway. Now that feels really off to her, but she isn't sure. And so he comes in, and then he proceeds to act in ways that are making her increasingly uncomfortable. But she starts worrying about what her roommate is going to think of him, but of her. And the next thing you know. So let's move on. So those are all, sorry, I'm going to step back and say, all of those feelings, the insecurity, the not being sure, the not trusting yourself, all of those things are totally normal reactions to a situation with someone you know and perhaps like, in a situation where you should feel safe, and in this instance, your own home. But those totally normal reactions actually delay our acknowledgement of the danger, and therefore actually increase the danger to us. Okay? So let's look at the program then. So the program is a 12-hour program, 4 3-hour units. And it's designed to exactly deal with the kinds of obstacles that I've described so far. It's designed to decrease the time it takes for someone to acknowledge the situation as dangerous or as if something is wrong, to reduce those emotional obstacles to taking action, and then to absolutely maximize the chance that the person will be able to use the verbal and physical self-defense tactics that we know from research are most likely to be effective to get her out. So I'm going to talk about each of the each of the 4 units, the 4 3-hour sessions. And so I'm first going to say, I'm just going to give you a briefest overview. It's like the Reader's Digest version of the program, because we don't have time to go into them. I'm happy to answer more questions. I said that one of the things about the cultural messages is that it makes it about a problem that's out there. We all have what's called an optimism bias about anything, about crime, about disease, anything like that. How likely is it you're going to be in an automobile accident? Not very likely, so everybody else is at more risk. And the same is true of sexual assault. And so we need to actually interrupt that if we're going to make what's coming in this program that's 12 hours long relevant to the young women who are taking it. And so through series of activities, young women learn that they also are at risk, but again, not so high that it would actually elevate fear. Then the other thing, and the most important thing that the ASSESS program, or the ASSESS unit does, is it counters all of that knowledge that I said was coming from the culture that's actually wrong about what are the risks about, and counters those with what we know to be the real risk cues in men's behavior and in situations that make it more likely that coercion will happen. So making explicit the violence, power, and control in sexual assault, and then making really clear what the research evidence is. And then giving women practice to actually apply their knowledge. So let me give you an example. The research says clearly that when there is isolation, risk is escalated. And I'm sure that even if I hadn't put this picture on the screen, for many of you, this is the kind of imagining you would have about when I'm talking about isolation, the underground parking lot that virtually every woman who has ever driven in a car fears at night. But in fact, this is not the isolation that creates risk, because strangers are not the primary perpetrators. This kind of situation where you're moving away from where there are people to where there are fewer people, and the loud music is creating a sound barrier that means that if you called out, no one would hear you. This is the kind of isolation that is much in these social situations is much more likely to elevate risk, right? It does elevate risk. And basically that means that by elevating risk, I mean it gives perpetrators an advantage. So this is the kind of thing that the ASSESS unit discusses. The second unit, acknowledge, is a complicated and wonderful unit. It basically creates a safe place to explore, each woman exploring her own emotional barriers to seeing danger in these kinds of situations from men that she knows. And strengthening women's trust of themselves, that when they feel that something is wrong, they are most likely right. And in fact, the research supports their inklings about this. So we're basically here undoing female socialization for nice in just 3 hours. The message is trust yourself. You have a right to defend your sexual integrity, and your safety concerns are more important than concerns about hurting someone's feelings or being rude or any of those kinds of things. And there's practice in actually dealing with verbal coercion. The ACT unit, the third unit, is the one that many young women are most excited about, as you can imagine. And again, we're countering the kinds of messages that women have been taught. Contradicts self-defense myths, like you probably heard these, women will just get hurt worse if they fight back. In fact, the research is entirely the opposite. It presents evidence of what the most effective self-defense tactics are, and those are leaving or getting away at the earliest possible opportunity, even before things have escalated. Forceful verbal tactics, so that would be something like swearing, yelling, screaming right in his face, anything like that. And forceful physical tactics like pushing, shoving, kicking, biting, scratching, any of those kinds of things. And each woman is developing a toolbox of escalating strategies, right? If one doesn't work, you move to the next one, that she would feel comfortable using of the ones that are most effective. The fourth session sort of takes a slightly different tack. It now is designed to relate to the other common situation of sexual assault by male intimates in longer-term relationships, which is even more common as young women, heterosexual women get older, bisexual women get older. So the program is not just about refusing what somebody else wants. This unit is emancipatory sex education that most of us lack. So it's information for sure, but it's also what are your own desires and values? Like, do you know what you desire? And what we know from the research is that the more knowledge and confidence we have about our own desires, the faster we're able to detect pressure and coercion, all of those things. So if you think now about the situation that I described earlier, right, that one about the man who comes to the door of the apartment, a young woman who had taken flipped the script with EAAA would know that his persistence, his insistence that he come in when she'd made it clear her roommate wasn't home and she didn't want him to, is actually the warning sign that she thought it was, right? And she would be more likely to trust herself. She would also know that the isolation of her own apartment when her roommate isn't home is increasing the danger to her and increasing his advantages. And so, for example, she might actually consider, if she can't keep him out of the apartment, leaving her own apartment and going knocking on a neighbor's door. That is something we almost never think of, leaving our own space. But if you know that it is increasing the danger to you, then you sometimes do. So she would get the firm message that she's right when she feels that something's off, and it's her right to get mad and to resist. She'd also know that those forceful verbal and physical strategies are likely to be effective, and she'd know to escalate if one of them didn't work and to keep going until she was safe. So that would be the difference in those situations. Now, I said that there's a lot of research that goes into actually making sure that something works. And after more than a decade, I conducted with a team what's called a randomized control trial that is the gold standard for evidence, similar to medical research. This research was published, in fact, in the New England Journal of Medicine. So what I'm showing you here, for those of you who are not, like, graphs are not your friend, is that time is along the bottom axis, or the x-axis. And the blue line is women were randomly assigned either to get the program or to be in a brochure session. That's like what was on every university campus. Just go in a room, there's a bunch of brochures, there's somebody you can ask questions of. The blue line are women in the control group. And so across the 12 months after they were enrolled in the study, you can see that the completed rape rate is 9.8%. So almost 1 in 10 of those young women experienced a completed rape by the end of that next year. And we should probably take a minute to think about that statistic. It's very upsetting. But what you'll also see is that the women who had the program, that the rate, of course, sexual assaults are not to zero, but the completed rape rate was very much lower. In fact, it's a 50% reduction in both. It's actually higher for attempted rape, but when you combine completed and attempted together, you get a 50% reduction at the end of 1 year, and actually even at the end of 2 years, it's still effective. What this means in real terms, taking it away from a graph, is that you'll only need to have 13 young women in one group for there to be 1 fewer attempted or completed rapes that they experience by the end of that year. And you might want to ask yourself, okay, you're imagining university students, which women does it work for? Well, of university students, it works for both white women and racialized women. It works for women of all sexual identities, heterosexual women, bisexual women, and lesbians. And it works for women who have already experienced sexual violence, so survivors, and women who had no prior history of victimization. Now, how do we actually get to that reduction? Well, we know, we were able to show statistically and through the magic of statistics that the way that this works is that we are decreasing woman blaming and belief in rape myths. And when we do that, we also pair that with increased perception of your own personal risk, increased accuracy about your own risk, and we put those together, that in fact leads to better and faster detection of risk in situations. And also they know more about what the most effective self-defense tactics are, and they're more willing to use them, and at earlier stages of coercion, and they have increased confidence that they could defend themselves if they needed to. And when you put all those things together, then you see the reductions in sexual assault. And very importantly, because we did not move the sexual assaults to zero, there's also lower self-blame if a rape is experienced. And that's very important, as many of you know, for long-term recovery. Here is an example from one survivor who was in this early trial who wrote to me outside, tracked down my email, and she had experienced a rape in high school, and she said her social life had just diminished. She was barely ever going out, and she took the program in her first year of university, and she said much longer, but this was one sentence: "Thank you for giving me my freedom back." So that's the program in a nutshell. And just to wrap this up then and sort of say, what are the points then that we learn about this and how to move it forward in the work that you do as well? Absolutely, we know that a one-size-fits-all approach, if I tried to do this for women and men and non-binary students and everyone, not everyone is having the same issues in the starting place, and so this would totally not be effective. So you have to ask, who is your audience and what are the problems that you need to solve in that work? Successful prevention almost always is developed by, in fact, I don't know of a single instance where it's not, by and with those who have prevention expertise, which doesn't mean if you don't, that you can't partner with someone who does, and because you have other knowledge that will be critical to this work. It's critical for successful prevention that we go beyond knowledge and awareness. I think you can probably see from the way that I talked about the program, that's not knowledge and awareness. That's much, much more, much deeper than that. And then we need to actually do the evaluation to ensure we're getting what we want and we're not getting what we don't want. You know, if we found that my program all of a sudden increased women's fear so much that they were feeling, you know, like they were not capable of going out in the world, that would be a terrible thing. And we would want to make sure that we were never doing that. And for men's programs, again, we want to make sure that we're not actually increasing sexual coercion. So one of the things I'm suggesting to you is that we often think about collaborating as a bunch of people getting together, and from the very beginning, we work together and we work together for the whole project. But prevention usually works somewhat differently. So I'm suggesting that first of all, you find out what has already been done and what works. And unfortunately, there's not as many successful programs as we'd hope. So sometimes you can't find something that actually works with your audience, but sometimes you can find something that has shown promise. And then those would be people you'd want to collaborate with. Sometimes you don't want to collaborate. You want to ask them for permission to use like a really high quality activity that you think will just do exactly what you need it to do. I did that in my program. I didn't write the ones that someone else had already accomplished, or even ask for permission to use the whole program. I did that, not the whole program, but I asked to use a number of units from the Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education Program because they are the expert on that. And so then they gave me permission. I built them in and made them work for my purposes. Then you build other elements that are missing in terms the theory is telling you it or is missing based on high quality evidence. So then you write those other pieces around it, then you evaluate it, you revise it and do it again. And I probably am in something like, I think by the time I showed that randomized control trial, showed that it worked, that was probably study 6, something like that, and of revisions to show you how long it takes. Now, I said I asked people to use their materials or learned from them first before I started. This was a partial list at the very beginning, and I'm not putting up there that you have to read every name, but all these collaborators, Wendo, Women's Self-Defense was integral to the ACT unit, and so on. And since this time, I've continued to build and borrow practices from others with their permission, and so this could be many screens full. The other reason we need to collaborate sometimes is that we go beyond our own expertise. And so, for example, the English version of this, I had the expertise with my training. And so, yes, as you heard, it's now being used in a number of studies for university students. But then I was approached by Isabelle Dagnon to say, well, but in Canada, we have many Francophone students as well. Do you have a version in French? No, I don't, and I'm ashamedly a unilingual Anglophone, and therefore it is outside my expertise. So Isabelle has been leading a team on which I'm just a co-investigator. We have a French language version of the program, but again, that might change something. So we're just starting the research this fall, COVID delays, to test that it is effective with Francophone students. A young colleague or a young researcher approached me and said, this is very intensive in person, but I know that small universities don't feel like they have the resources to offer it. Do you think it's possible to facilitate this online? And I was not at all sure. In fact, I said no for several years, I admit, until she wore me down and brought in other examples of actual live facilitation. And we've now done some adaptation and pilot tests, but I could not have done this without her, so she was the co-lead. And we just got funding to do a randomized control trial that will start next fall, testing the effectiveness. I said from the beginning, trans women were always included in the program, but trans men were not, and nor were other students under the large trans umbrella. So, in fact, I have very little expertise in that area, but Sarah Peitzmeyer does. And so we have done since all kinds of formative research and are now working to adapt the program for transgender students. We'll need to get grant funding to prove it, to test the effectiveness later on. We're much further along on the program for younger girls. So you may have been thinking in your head, but this doesn't start till university. And in fact, we know that 50% of the rapes women experience in their lives happen by the time we're 18. So we do need to start younger. And I'd done some soft adaptations early on, but I did not have the time or the money to go further. So with Dr. Sarah Cran, she pushed this forward. We got Public Health Agency of Canada funds and did some preliminary research and have done a deep adaptation for younger girls 14 to 17, and that trial starts in January. Was supposed to start 2 years ago, but COVID intervened again. And then, of course, there's all the collaborations on campuses and communities that it takes to implement effective programs like mine. And so that's things like the help with recruitment of the participants, the people in the community, so therapists, trauma-informed therapists in the community who are on backup in case the facilitators who are doing this work very intensively need to talk to someone, and all of the people on campuses booking rooms and all of these things, so other kinds of collaborations as well, and seeing how this works for their own students. So I'm leaving you now with two of the posters, just two of the posters we use to attract different students with different kinds of interests, as you probably can tell. And just give you a moment to look at those. Because recruitment is something else that is, some people, for prevention is something else that we often don't think enough about. It's, if you don't have anyone sitting in the room, then you are not preventing anything. And I am happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that. Wow, that's really eye-opening for me and very intriguing. I have a question right off the bat just from me, and that is, do you feel that, I know you say there's no one solution that works for everyone, but do you, like, to me, this sounds like a great foundation for every young girl or college or high school age, a woman to learn, because, you know, a lot of the reasons, these skills that they don't have are sometimes, I don't want to speak like an expert, but are the reasons for, you know, domestic violence later on. I mean, sometimes it's, or just any interpersonal violence because a woman is unsure of herself and doesn't trust her gut and all that. Or do you think I'm off the track? Is there a connection?
There's a connection between our lack of confidence in believing ourselves, our socialization, the messages that everyone gives us, and how quickly we are able to recognize that things are going wrong or that they're not right, and that this is, you know, this is not a space that we don't need to make excuses. We can just get out. Though there are many parallels. Also, some of the risk cues that women learn or girls learn in this program are parallels. So things like, you know, sexual entitlement, like someone who acts as if they're entitled to sex, that is a risk factor for sexual coercion, but that is often common also in intimate partner violence perpetrators, and the same about sort of the game playing and those kinds of things. So there are connections, and yes, I do think that this is something that it would be amazing for all of its parts if it was available to girls and women across the ages. But we couldn't just do this, because if you just have programs for girls, then that does in itself suggest that only girls are the ones who can fix this problem. And right? And this is not the case. This is about resisting what's already there, right? But we need to give the parallel messages, and this is why I'm saying we always need the comprehensive. We need to be saying it is everyone's responsibility to step in. It is everyone's responsibility to realize that sexual violence is a problem that they are part of in this society. And it's also, of course, very, very important that there are programs for boys and men that, even if we have not found them to be as effective as we wish yet, that are undermining woman blaming, that are undermining toxic masculinity and the belief that men always have to be in charge and those kinds of things. And also that around the sexual messages, that, you know, men are not always interested in sex, and that idea, many young men say that they initiate sex when they don't. This is about consensual sex, but that they initiate sex when they themselves don't want it because they feel that they must, right? That men, they must always be ready. Well, that is unwanted sex that young men do not need to have experience, right? They need to know that that's not the case, and so on. So many of these things are all tied together for sure.
This is amazing. Yes, it is a good tool, but it, you know, you're right.
It can't be the only one we have.
No, otherwise that would say that it's the women's fault, right? So you're right.
Yeah,
You're absolutely
or
right.
that the burden of solving it is women's, and it's not. This is there are things that women can do that can help us be safer. Just like in the analogy of, it's not our fault when we get sick from a bacteria or a virus, but there's things we can do to boost our immune system, right? We can wear masks, we can do all of these things. Are we responsible if we get sick? No, we are not. But there are things that might help us fight back.
Well said. Well said. Let's see if there's any questions here. Wow, this topic is so exciting to me. Is there a version of your program that's for younger girls available yet, or is it still in the works?
It's ready. There is one site in Canada that has permission to use not that version, but like a lightly adapted version of the first year university program, just because they were so persistent. That's going on in BC. But we are trying to wait till we know it's for sure effective, but so it's not being offered outside of the research study. If the people who are watching are in Ontario, the program will be offered as part of the research in this trial in 4 regions of Ontario, starting in January. So Windsor, Essex, Norfolk, London, and Kingston broad areas. So if there's girls between 14 and 17 in those neighborhoods, they can sign up for the research. Once we start advertising, you can just contact me or the SARE Center, and we'll put your name on the list to find out more. And in that study, the randomization is to get the program right away or in 6 months. So every girl who signs up in the study will get it, because we know for the older girls that it works. So we didn't feel like it was ethical to withhold the program to test it. So it's called a waitlist control.
Right. Wow. Amazing. That's so exciting. Can't wait to hear the results. You mentioned bystander approaches to sexual violence prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about those and what they can accomplish?
Sure. Just let me see. I've actually got a slide. So this, or I got 2 slides. This is the goal that I said we need to change both the culture and our community. And so when we're talking about bystander kinds of intervention, and there are many good programs, we're talking about doing culture change through individual change. And the idea here is that this kind of education approaches people not as potential victims or perpetrators, but as everyone being a citizen who could see something and be able to intervene. And so it basically empowers everyone. It doesn't make people defensive in that way, which is a great thing. And the idea is that if we were to do that on a large scale, if we were to get a whole community who are all trained in bystander intervention, for example,
right,
then those perpetrators are surrounded by people who recognize what they're doing early on, don't think it's okay, are very willing to intervene, and are going to. So what we know from the research, and this is Latne and Darley's research, is that sometimes we think, well, people just don't help because they're mean or because they don't care. But in fact, the research shows that people care a lot. They just don't know what to do. And so if we have a bunch of people watching something, then first of all, they have to notice the thing and either sort of pay attention to it or turn away. But then they have to actually see it as an emergency. And by that, I mean, they have to see it as something that is a problem, right? And not as something that's normal, but as something that is starting to be a problem. And then if they see it as a problem, then they have to think it's their responsibility. And that's what I was talking about everyone. We want everyone to think, yep, it's my responsibility. If I see it, it's my responsibility. And then they need to attempt to help. And so we need to give them skills. Again, I said it can't just be knowledge. We also have to give them the skills. What could you do if you see things? And so bystander programs work on all of these things so that instead of what is sort of natural in the world, which is by the end, you have very few people intervening. Instead, you would have most of that big crowd taking and actually perhaps sharing ideas on what they could do to help.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm. There's always the stigma about being a bystander. I know you mentioned that it's a very small percentage, but in the area of earlier signs and noticing, you know, certain things, there's a much bigger percentage of bystanders around, and I think there's still a lot of fear. Does it help to have some kind of corroborating education for people, because people don't want to get their friends mad at them or to be rejected?
That's right. Yeah, so just absolutely. So similar to in my program where we're saying like these things that you think like, so if a man is touching you too much or like you barely know them and they're sort of making sexual innuendos and that makes you feel yuck. Well, you actually, that is yuck. That person is at higher risk of perpetration. And the same is true here. You know, you sort of, well, it was just a rape joke, right? It's just a joke. But we can actually show from research, these programs show that these are part of the same problem. And that often if you can intervene and not make normal some of these things, then other behaviors that perpetrators would want to engage in, they're much more visible. Now, when everybody isn't just saying, oh, it was just a joke and really, can we say anything? We're embarrassed. But then also giving them more tools to intervene, because you don't always have to wade in there, right? There's many things you can do. So like bystander programs show things like, you know, you see a young woman being berated in a public place by someone who looks like their boyfriend, right? Well, you know, one way is to go up and confront the boyfriend. That would not be a way where you're necessarily protecting your own safety. But you could go up, pretend to know her, and ask her if she has a tampon and if she could come to the bathroom with you, right? So right, there's many. I mean, I'm just giving you extreme. But then you actually got her in the private location. You've made it clear that this is not about his behavior, just right there. So she's not in danger. You're not in danger, right? All of those kinds of things.
Right. Well, I know we're slightly over time, but I want to ask one quick, more related question. Do you feel that, or do you believe that women or young women or girls who take this EAAA course would become better bystanders? Like, because do you think that would create good bystanders? Yeah. And this isn't just about me, it's about, hey,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a big part of this is to say also, this is information you can share with your friends. Okay. You know, when you see, and we give them lots of resources, but also we do talk about, we have bystander posters on the wall at lunch and those kind of things to say, absolutely, this is a community issue.
Oh, Dr. Senn, thank you so much. This is just so enlightening, and I know, I'm sure a lot of people watching today and listening in the future, as well as we're going to have this online, are going to find it very helpful in what they're doing and in abuse prevention. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Great work. That was wonderful. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
No.
So no questions.
No.
Okay, we got
21.
We had 21, then 24, then 26, then 23 people kind of up and down. So there were a lot of people in listening and watching.
Yeah, I know. That's good. Well, great.
Well, they'll be sorry when they watch later because they won't be able to ask questions. They'll miss their opportunity.
Bye.
Yeah. Well, it's very informative, and I think it's really important.
Great.
Far too often, I don't know, women don't say anything and they don't realize, right? So
yeah.
Silence is is equally as detrimental as, you know, I think it's actually worse in a lot of cases. And women sometimes just don't feel like they have the power to speak.
Yes.
So giving them the ability to do that and empowering them to speak up when they know that something's wrong. You know it's wrong in the pit of your stomach, you should follow the gut.
Right.
And we're taught from a very young age to sort of not
ignore
disown
it.
that.
That's right.
And that's
it's
really hard to reprogram that after the fact. So it's fantastic that you have a program out there now to help address that and give women the power that they need to recognize those early warning signs, be better for themselves, better advocates for themselves and their friends and partners. So
thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye
now.
Bye.
Bye.
Great meeting you.
Great.
Bye.